Growth Product Manager at Chartio, and I'm going to be talking today about how to improve a data model as a product manager. A little bit about me. So I've been a product manager for 7 years. I've worked at Adecco, Udacity, Chartio, and also as a part-time instructor on data at General Assembly. The agenda for this talk, I'm going to talk about how a PM's questions kind of naturally become more and more complex. And then I'm going to talk about how do we reduce this complexity and make it easier for other people within the company to ask the same sort of questions. And finally, I'm going to talk about some common places within a data model that could be improved even from a PM. Okay, so first let's talk about how a PM's questions become complex. So initially we'll start with a very reasonable question to ask. What is the number of active users? Right off the bat, we have to define what we mean by active and what we mean by users. So in SQL, we have to get very specific. And so initially here, we are defining active as any action that was taken within the last 30 days. And users here, we're not actually going to filter anything here. We're just going to say everyone in the users table. Oftentimes, that's not the case. Oftentimes you'll want to filter out your own employees and perhaps some specific test accounts. So something to be aware of, but here we're not going to filter that. So we could run this query and we could get a result. Okay, we got 1,000 active users. We know a little bit more about this metric, but with any new metric, we're going to want to start doing different things with it. So we're going to want to filter other data by this metric. We're going to want to aggregate and segment data by this metric. And lastly, we're going to want to see it over time or at a given point in time in the past. So we could think of some ways this would apply to active users. So we might want to filter what emails did non-active users receive. We might want to aggregate what actions did active users do the most, and then perhaps we might want to see what all of those metrics look like a month ago. For the purpose of this talk, we're going to filter and aggregate what emails did non-active users receive. So to do this, we're going to have to kind of create an interim table to be able to join and filter on for the rest of the data. So we want a table here that labels each of the users as either active or non-active. And so you can see here I moved the action criteria from the where clause into a case statement. And so now we're creating this table out to the right where we're labeling by ID whether or not a user is active or not active. To then ask the question, which emails did non-active users receive, we then wrap an outer query around it. So we're joining to this interim table and then using its fields to filter by so that we can do this aggregation and get the number by subject line of what emails non-active users received. So, if we go back here, this is quite a long query, lots of areas to get mixed up, and quite a high expectation for the rest of the company to know both how to write a subquery, how we're currently defining active user, and so there's a huge chance they're not going to be able to reproduce this query or use this sort of interim table in the proper way. So it might be much easier if we just created a new field on our users table that labeled everybody as active user and non-active user so they can more easily query it. So you could imagine if this is what our data look like, that previous query could be this simple. where we only have to join in the emails to the users table, and we can just directly filter on that field, that active user field, without having to add in a subquery and without having to define active users within the query. Imagine if the field already existed. So this simple query versus this quite complex query. This is much more reasonable for people to grasp and for people to use properly. So how do we make this happen? How do we add a field to the table itself so that other people can ask the sorts of questions they want utilizing this new metric? So the old way this got done was you would ask a data engineer, hey, can you add this new metric to the users table? They will likely say yes, maybe not, depending on a bunch of rules they might have about their database. But regardless of their response, the amount of work it would take in order to add this field in the past was kind of expensive. Most of the transformations to data would happen in a tool such as Airflow, which is programmed in more of a programming language. It's a little bit more complex. And lastly, the data engineers, they have a lot of other tasks that they need to be doing, and so this is kind of a low-level task. Obviously, they see you can query it without it being added, and they don't necessarily want to add more to a data model. So the big red flag here is that it's expensive for them to think about it, for them to do it, especially when you think about what else they could be doing that might be more important. And lastly, another problem here is that while you submitted it, you might still be playing with it, and then you might want to change some aspect about how you define active users. And then you're going to have to go through this whole process over again. So this has been traditionally a sticking point for non-data engineer people contributing to the data model. But that is all changing now. So let me talk about how it's much easier now to help make queries easier. So there's been this phenomenal tool that's growing like crazy, especially in Silicon Valley, but all around the country and around the world. There's a tool called DBT. DBT is a SQL-based modeling language that sits on top of your data warehouse. Well, it can be placed in many places, but the simplest implementation is on top of your data warehouse, and it allows you to create views on top of your data, which means that the underlying data isn't impacted. So you can make versions of your data however you see fit without being worried about data loss or anything like that. So much less costly in terms of the mistakes are not that big of a deal, and much more approachable because it is SQL based. So how do we get this into our data model? Well, first we just write the query that would produce the table that we wish we had. So here I'm selecting star, so everything from the users table. And then I'm putting in that case statement where we were labeling the data before. And that's going to produce this table out to the right, which is what we were looking for. So now we're getting everything from the users table, plus we're going to add in those labels around active user and non-active user. Now, here's maybe the little bit of the tricky part. You do need to be a bit familiar with Git in order to get these changes made. But I just wanted to show how few steps it really is in terms of using Git in order to make this change. So you first git clone, which means you copy the repository, the DBT model of your data down to your computer. You then create your own branch using git checkout -b. That's creating a new branch. You give it a name. I gave the name of myself. Then here you have atom dot. So that's me opening my text editor, which will open that file structure of the data model. Then you can find wherever the users table is defined in that data model. You can edit that SQL file, and then you add those changes back to the model by doing git add. Then you commit those changes, and then lastly you push those changes up, and this push part puts it up online. And then once wherever your repository is hosted, you will then create a pull request from your branch into the master branch, and that's what we have here to the right. So the git stuff sounds complex, but really you only need to do 5 git commands in order to both get access to the data model and push it back up. So it's really not as complex as you might think. There's a ton of tutorials around Git if you are at all unfamiliar, and also people within your company are likely skilled at this and can help you make your first data model change. If you are concerned about even messing around with Git, just giving the data engineer the query itself is a huge help, versus kind of saying like, hey, could you add an active users field? You're getting quite specific about exactly what you want, so you're doing a lot of the work for them, which makes it much easier, much more likely to get factored in faster. But if you can, I would go this step, because creating a pull request will notify the engineer, and then they'll be able to review and edit the changes that you've submitted within whatever hosting repository situation they have set up, which will be more normal to their workflow as well. So more likely to get factored in faster. Lastly, you do need to run this model. So you push this code in, the engineer approves it, he gets it merged in. Last thing you need it to run, so that all of the data on the database is processed by the DBT modeling, so that then you get out that table that we want. Sometimes, as kind of shown here, models are run on a schedule, so the data engineer can let you know the next time it's going to run. Other times you can just run it directly if you want it quicker. And then you'll be able to query this improved data. So, again, we talked about how much simpler the data is going to be for others to query. So if we go back to our original question of what is the number of active users, we see here on the left a very simple query, whereas on the right we had to define what active meant. So now it's embedded in the data model. And then again, if we want to get the which emails were non-active users getting, the one on the left is much more straightforward than the one on the right, where we have to embed the subquery. So now that you kind of know that you're able to improve the data just by knowing SQL and defining what these new tables might look like, let's look at a more complex set of problems that you might run into. So we talked about kind of adding fields that contain business logic, but there's other things that could be cleaned up, such as just confusing columns, inconsistent naming, non-descriptive columns, non-descriptive values, JSON, and deprecated data. So let's look at like a messy table here. So here we have kind of 2 ID columns. This might be confusing for people to query, not knowing which to use when. Here we have a series of nulls and inconsistent naming going on, so names are sort of repeated. Maybe people are entering in weird values for human entered fields. And then we also have location, where the granularity of the location isn't consistent. So we have, Texas, which is a state, versus USA, which is a country, and maybe even USA versus US. So this is often a problem when you have free-form entry fields. It's a good reminder to try to constrain how people can enter data so that you don't get this type of messiness. Here we have a column where the name is hard to interpret. What does type mean? And then it's filled with numbers, which if you don't know, it would be impossible to figure out. And this is actually quite a common problem. So engineers will often build a database for the app with a little bit of cryptic language, just because it's easier for them to code. But when you want to do analytics on it, it's much harder. It's much harder to ask a question of this data. So something to look out for. Another one would be JSON. Unless you're quite skilled at SQL, doing queries on this is pretty hard. And perhaps there's just one of the key value pairs that you want for this set of data. So we'll talk through how you can perhaps pull that out. And then lastly, in databases, a lot of times people don't want to ever delete data. But they might have a field where they flag if the data sort of has been deleted. So perhaps some user doesn't want an account anymore. And so we deleted their account. We would flag it as deleted because maybe then they want to come back, and then you would reactivate it. But you didn't get rid of all of the data. So maybe you flag certain rows. So we can now look at what would be ways to clean this data up. So we could potentially drop this column. And again, with DBT, since you're building a view on top of the underlying data, this data never goes away. We're just building a view on top of this. So in our view on top of this, we could exclude this second ID column. We could perhaps join in a consistent name column, like an email. So that might be easier to identify who these people are. Instead of having kind of these hard to use name fields. We could standardize the location, turning everything into the country level and standardizing what the country level names are. We can then rename fields. Instead of type, access level makes much more sense. And then we could make the field values also things that make much more sense, like can view or can edit. And then for the JSON, we could exclude that column, but we could pull out the key value pair of whatever status is. So pull status as our column name, and then whatever the value is, we can use as the field. And then lastly, we could exclude any row that was flagged as true for is deprecated. So this seems like a lot, and it is a decent amount of improvements that you could make. But I want to show you here. This is the sequel to make all of those changes, and they're just here set up as a chain of common table expressions where each one you're querying from the next one. But it's just SQL, so just SQL can make all of these changes happen. So it's all stuff that a PM with a little bit of SQL skills can do. Again, any of these changes in this process you'll be submitting, and you'll get them reviewed, and you as a company can all help work to make your data model better. So, your data is going to constantly be changing. PMs are always going to come up with new metrics that they want to look into. And so this process is kind of ongoing, but there's a real opportunity for more PMs to take an active role in improving their data model instead of always just kind of throwing it over the wall and waiting for changes. These are things you can be proactive about to both make your analysis easier and to make analysis easier for others. And I especially want to highlight, so I work at Chartio, and we have a visual SQL interface that lets people write queries just using drag and drop and exploring the data like you see here. And when you clean up the data in the ways that I just talked about, it makes it so easy for anyone in the company to be able to find insights based on these new metrics that you've defined. So that's the talk for me. I'd love to get connected with more PMs who want to talk about improving data models. So I also run dataschool.com, where I put out a lot of educational content for free. But feel free to reach out to me as well at mdavid@chartio.com. And thank you for attending. I appreciate it.